Have you ever had a moment where it felt like God completely shut a door on you only to find out later that He was actually moving you towards something better? Because that happened to our family. And it started with something as small as a refinancing that we thought we needed falling through and not happening. I thought we would talk about how to plan a life with God and how to rest in the fact that God has a plan, even when it feels like everything is going wrong. Now, the idea for this video, I have to tell you, was not entirely my own. I saw another video by Spirit Filled Home, and it was such a lovely video and topic that it impressed me to share my story on the same topic and my experience in this area. But I do recommend you go watch Spirit Filled Home's video as well, because it's definitely worth watching. So I want to tell you the story of how the time something that we thought was a complete financial disaster and crisis turned out to be the exact thing God was going to use to move our family to a better place, to our mountain homestead that we have now. Okay, so I'm going to be entirely honest with you right now. I am a recovering pessimist. So I've experienced a lot of trauma in my past, and because of that, I've had to consistently overcome feelings of rejection, lots of negative feelings of rejection, abandonment, and feeling like the Lord doesn't care, like life is harder than it should be, and like I'm alone. Okay, so these are things I struggle with, and I've been going through something lately that's kind of bringing some of it up. So recently my insurance company, they sent me a letter saying they're no longer going to cover my medication, not the brand that I need. They'll cover a different one, but unfortunately the one they say they'll cover doesn't work for me. I've tried it before and it just doesn't work. So for 2 months I have been going around and around with my insurance companies and doctor, and it's just been kind of a nightmare. And the other night it got to me and I just finally crumbled. Now, if you're under 40, you probably don't know this yet, but once you start getting into your 40s and climbing up in them, there is what is called an aging burst. It's a real thing. It's a scientific thing. Now, a lot of people think that you age in a linear fashion, it's like gradually aging, but science has found that that's not really true. We age in bursts. There's one in your 40s, and then there's another one in your 60s. Now, before you say, oh, that won't happen to me, just be careful with that. Let me just tell you, I used to think that, and oh my Lord, the Lord has humbled me. See, I've been into health my whole life. I've cooked from scratch forever. I've tried to eat healthy and feed my family for most of my life. And I've tried to do all this healthy, and I've always been very health conscientious. I even have my master's in herbology from the School of Natural Healing, okay? So when it comes to health stuff, I know what I'm talking about. I know my stuff there. I honestly thought I was going to skip perimenopause and the whole aging in the 40s thing, but life has a way of humbling you, no matter how much you know. Back to the other night when I crumbled. I just felt like all these negative feelings. I felt like I was quietly being edged out, I guess you could say. It kind of feels like the further you get up in age, the more the world says it has no use for you anymore. God says differently, but it seems like the world says it has no use. So I started thinking this thought process again, and I had to stop myself. I started remembering all of the times in my life where God has shown me He does have a plan. So I picked myself up very reluctantly, and I reminded myself that every time in life where I thought something horrible and disastrous was happening, I mean, there are times that that's happened, but so many times where I thought something was really bad that was happening, something good came out of it. The trick that I've always found is you have to change your thinking from faithlessness to faithfulness, and it is not easy. Instead of saying something negative, you can ask though, okay, what is the meaning of this? What's next? What is God trying to show me in this, and where do I need to go from here? So in that season is where I'm at right now with this situation, and I'll be honest, it's kind of a scary place to be. But I want to tell you about another time in my life and remind myself of this other time in my life when I was in this exact same situation. There was a time we were living in town and our interest rates were extremely high. Our needs were just growing and growing and growing and not being met. For example, our refrigerator was shooting craps. We had appliances also shooting craps all at the same time. We needed to replace them. We also needed to get some new windows, and everything just cost so much. And we couldn't afford to fix anything because The mortgage on our home was so high and the living expenses were so high. The power bill, everything. For 2 years before this, interest rates had been historically low, by the way, and we kept wanting to refinance, but we hadn't lived in the house long enough for the first portion of that. And then we needed to have our jobs longer. So my husband was self-employed and he needed at least 2 years of self-employment before we could even apply for refinancing. So finally, that time came where we could. By the time we could refinance, by the time my husband had been self-employed just long enough, he went in to immediately start the refinancing process. And guess what? That very month, the interest rates shot back up. So we missed the window of opportunity. Refinancing wasn't going to help us anymore. We could have had it so good had we just been able to do it a little bit sooner. Now, at that time, when he came home and he told me that, I remember that my heart just, it sank. So many times in our life, we had been up against these hard walls and lived through them, and it was hard. And for a moment, my mind went through the hard times we went through in the place of thinking we fell through the cracks again. God must just not care that much about us and our needs. Kind of like the Israelites in the wilderness. And I started crying. So many times in my life, I felt that helplessness, that hopelessness, and so many tears, and here I was again. But then all of a sudden, something shifted. I caught myself. I remembered this one time before where it was unmistakable that God had plucked us up and brought us to a better place. And in that moment, I remember that I had decided to believe that God must have a better plan. So instead of crying about it and the whole refinancing thing, I said, there's something else. There's somewhere else we're meant to be, and we just can't see it yet. Now, the home that we were living in at that time, I thought it was our forever home. I had no intention to ever move. Moving into it was so hard and stressful that I had sworn I am never going through this again. I'm never going to move again. But a couple of years into living there, it was not going how I had envisioned our town life to go. It wasn't as fun as I thought it was going to be. It's no fun living in town when you don't actually have money to spend going places and doing things, because you have to spend money to have very much fun when you live in town. So overall, I loved that home. I just had envisioned living in town and having a little bit more money to spend. So it just wasn't working out. One of the other problems with that home was the kitchen. I'm a from scratch cook, and that kitchen was like cooking on a little dot. I have got a lot of kids to cook for. Now, you've heard the phrase, losing my religion. Well, I might have done that a time or two in that kitchen, or maybe even 3. There just simply was not enough counter space to even put the dishes, the large dishes that I needed for my large family. It was just a constant cooking frustration. And every time I went into that kitchen to cook, the anxiety would go through the roof. And yeah. Another one of the problems with that sweet townhouse was there was no real backyard. It was a very small backyard, and we had a lot of kids. They were always out playing in the street, consequently. And the street is not a good place for kids to be. I was always calling them back in, get out of the street, get out of the street, get out of the street. There was people that would go by on that street like 40 miles per hour, even though it was a 25 per mile zone. So I lived in constant stress. Every time the kids went outside, I was always worried, are they going to be safe? And then one day I looked out and I saw a couple of my 4 boys climbing the neighbor's ornamental tree. And I'm like, at that point, I knew town life was just not working out for us. So when the whole refinancing thing fell through and didn't happen, after my little crying spell, I remember thinking very clearly, okay, that's it. God must have something else for us, and it's going to be better. Now, at the time, I had no idea how that would happen. We had no options. Homes in the country big enough for our family were not easy to find, and we were going to be in the same boat as we were already in, with the interest rates being through the roof. So we said a prayer. We said a little prayer, and then we carried on and kept putting one foot in front of the other. But it wasn't very long. It was within a week. I ran into a friend at the store. We started chatting, and I mentioned that our family would really love to find a place in the country. We've decided we don't want to be in town any longer. That's when she told me about her mother-in-law's place. The very next day, we went to see it. Now, before you can really appreciate what God did for us in that moment, in that period of time, I need to rewind about 30 years, because here's the crazy part. The place we ended up moving to was actually the exact dream that I had given up on decades earlier. When I was a teenager, it was my dream to live on a mountain, on a small farm, out in the woods and the forest. But by the time I was 30, I had completely, sadly given up on that dream. I had dreamed about this, dream homestead for over 15 years at that point, but it wasn't happening. And I remember my heart breaking again and again every time that dream just would not pan out. We had many homesteading attempts before. I started learning homesteading skills very young because that was my dream. Around 14 or 15, I was already canning food, sewing clothes, growing gardens. So one of the things I loved doing was all of those things actually, but one of them was canning, and I always envisioned canning food for my family. Well, one year I canned this huge batch of green beans that I got in a deal on for my family, but I had nowhere to store them. And they got too warm and they literally turned to like baby food mush in the jars. At another point, we got goats. It took me 5 years to build this beautiful little goat herd. But the hay where we lived in the Midwest was so expensive that we had to give up our goats. Also, with 4 young children, I simply didn't have the time to manage the goats too. So one day in my early 30s, I took my big encyclopedia of homesteading skills and all of those dreams that I had had for so long, and I remember plopping them down in this donate pile for Goodwill and resentfully just being frustrated. But I'm like, it's not happening, giving it up. Sometimes God asks us to give up our dreams. And at the time we think it's permanent, but it doesn't always end up being that way. So now let's skip ahead about 12 years. Suddenly, here I was with this dream that had lived in my heart for over 25 years, returning back to me. And here's the best part. The place that we moved to was already set up for homesteading. It kind of felt like the dream didn't just return, but it felt like it was returning to me with interest. So the moral of this story is that when you prayerfully create dreams with God, and when you talk to Him openly about the desires of your heart, and you keep Him first and keep faithfulness first, and maybe take some steps towards moving towards your dream, but with God at the forefront and trusting God with the outcome, you just never know what might happen. Sometimes what feels like God closing the door is actually Him reopening a dream that you thought was long gone that you'd forgotten about. So just remember, God does have a plan, and His plans are good because He is good. And when we can't see them yet, or we can't see the end result, there's still a plan, and it's all going to work out.
Sometimes we can get really caught up in what we wish life looked like right now, or what we thought life would look like right now. And in that case, when that happens, it becomes really easy to forget that we have a loving Heavenly Father who knows what is best for us and can see everything. And we forget that He knows best. And that when we give our life to God and we commit to walking with the Lord, that means we're giving Him the wheel. So sometimes we'll have a dream, and it is a dream that God placed on our heart, but our timing can be off. A really good example of this would be when I had a lot of little children. I was discouraged because a lot of our homestead dreams just kind of kept going up in smoke. And it was very discouraging. Looking back, as it turns out, and as they say, hindsight is everything, I can clearly see that the Lord simply wanted me investing in my children instead of animals. Honestly, He wanted me just pouring into the kids. Now, eventually, the dreams came back to me, but it didn't just come back to me. It came back to me and the children that I had raised, that I had invested in, that I had taught to think critically and taught how to research. So what would have been a burden to me at one point in our life later became a blessing that blessed not just me, but my children and my family as well. Now that's just my situation. Yours is probably going to look completely different lifestyle. But I just wanted to share this as an example of how when we plan with God, when we give Him our dreams and our plans, He works things out better than we could have. The patience part is very, very hard sometimes though, because if we have a dream and it's not the season for that dream, then we have to wait. And the 2 best things that I've learned to do in that season of waiting is to have faith and simply do the work that is in front of me.